is universal, yet, when it comes to children, we often hesitate and dismiss it. But have you ever thought, how do they process loss? Do they understand it the way the adults do? And more importantly, how can we help them? These are the tough questions we need to ask ourselves because children's grief is real and its impact lasts a lifetime. I'm your host, Sujala, and welcome to Discovering Journeys, a podcast where you will hear diverse stories that inspire, resonate, or open your mind to new perspectives. This is a special Podcasthon episode, a global podcasting event where creators come together to support meaningful causes. I am supporting a cause that means so much to me: children's grief. I have chosen the Children's Grief Foundation of Canada, which has been funding life changing programs across Canada, supporting thousands of children and families. But there's a challenge. Grief is a conversation people avoid, especially when it comes to children. Many believe kids don't grieve, that they are too young to understand loss. But the truth is, they do. And ignoring it doesn't make it go away, it only makes it harder for them to heal. In this episode, I am honored to be joined by Dr. Marissa Slaven, a palliative care physician with over 25 years of experience. She has walked alongside thousands of families in their most difficult moments and understands deeply the weight of grief. She is one of the board members of the Children's Grief Foundation. She is working to ensure that no grieving child feels alone. We are breaking the silence on how children experience grief, the understandings, misconceptions that hold us back, and the real ways we can support them. No matter who you are and what you do, this conversation will open your heart and change the way you see children's grief. So let's get into it. Hello, Marissa. I'm so happy that you're joining me on this podcast, on this special episode. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Your experience in palliative care spans over 25 years. What first drew you to this field of work?
That's a great question. When I was in medical school, I became very interested in medical oncology. And I think what I really liked about that was that you got to deal with all the different organ systems. So it's not just, I'm going to do heart for the next few decades or kidney. I really liked that it was everything. And then when I was in oncology, I did internal medicine and then oncology. There actually wasn't training in palliative care then. There wasn't such a thing as palliative care then. But a job opportunity came up. And I was just sort of immediately drawn to it because, in addition to being able to address the whole person's biology and all the different organs, you really got to do whole person care and look at their psychological and their social and their spiritual issues and their family and support system. And so I just really love that we can, in palliative care, look at people and their friends and family as a whole unit and not just a single organ.
I mean, it takes more than just the treating an organ, right? In this care,
Yeah, exactly.
it is layers.
It's layers and layers, and hopefully, and in many of my jobs in palliative care, you're part of an interdisciplinary team. So you're not the doctor doing it alone. You've got nurses and social workers and spiritual counselors and together and grief counselors, and together you can provide sort of that wraparound care that families need at that time.
What are some of the learnings you have had over the 25 years?
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I think that death is similar to birth in the medical sense, in that really our role as clinicians is to make sure that what's happening is appropriate, that people are as comfortable as can be, that things go as smoothly as can be, but then to step back, right, and let people have this experience, which again I think is an experience of family and love, both at birth and death. So I think that's been a really powerful thing for me as a physician to say, I have a place to help here, but also a place to stand back. Um, it's still really like we've come a long way, but it's so shocking to me how much people don't know about death and end of life and what to expect. And we've so medicalized it, and it happens in the hospital, away from home and family, and it's very sad. So certainly, as I've gone on in my career, making sure that I'm giving patients and families as much information as they want, keeping that door to having information open at all times so that they can be prepared and not shocked, because it's sad, but obviously it happens to everyone, and you can look at it and prepare for it and plan for it, or you can hide your head in the sand. Right? Those are sort of the options.
Has any statement or situation shocked you about how children's grief, especially, is perceived in the society?
Oh, for sure. I mean, people don't want to acknowledge that children even experience grief, and just I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, so fairly recently, I remember talking to somebody about this, not a medical person, and explaining sort of what we're doing at the Children's Grief Foundation, and the person said to me, like, I don't understand why a child would need additional support. I mean, they've got their parents after all, or their aunts and uncles, and I'm like, yes, but the surviving parent is also grieving. So how are they going to support the child who's grieving, right? Like, they've just gone through a huge loss themselves, and they don't know about children's grief either. Um, so just that somebody would even think that a child could get their support in the house when there's been so much grief in the house was shocking to me, like that lack of understanding.
Even in the recent years, if it is like this, it breaks my heart and it shocks me as well.
Yeah, yeah, me too. And people still, so much don't want to, bring the children to the hospital or to the hospice. But I think what people still don't realize is that, like, when you leave it to the child to imagine, what they imagine is so much worse than what they actually see. So every once in a while, I have patients who come to see me. I work at a cancer center. So my patients live at home and come to the cancer center for their palliative support. And some of them bring their kids with me, and the kids are like, oh, that's the doctor. Oh, that's mommy's doctor. Oh, okay. And it makes it less scary, right? That they've been there, that they've seen. Yeah, and people think that kids can't understand. And yes, every age child has a different level of understanding, but even a 4-year old understands something. So.
Yeah, that's for sure. I think it also affects on at what age a child loses a parent or a very close to loved one, because the understanding and grasping of the situation also matters. So do you think has it changed over the years in your experience, or the change is very, like, very minute?
I think what has changed is that there's a lot more knowledge out there about how children developmentally understand grief. So, from a very academic standpoint, if we look at the last decade, there's been a lot of good research and a lot of publications about this. The issue now that I see is that it's not translating from the academic world to the practical world.
Do you feel there is a huge gap of, especially the parents, who are the parents or the elders to say, that they are unaware of how to give support or understand the whole concept of what the kid can be going through.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. And I always try and encourage patients to say to them, I know you know your child best, and you'll know what's right for your child, but maybe the parent or the patient or whoever wants to talk to a social worker who has experience with children and get their insight, right? Because one of the things that I've found is the hardest for patients to admit, the patients who are dying, who are palliative, who have children, to admit that loss is so hard and so painful to them. Like any parent would worry about their child and what the future would be, and the huge loss that that person is going through, thinking, I'm never going to see my child graduate, I'm never going to see my child get married. um, and then to have them try and act on that, right? It's a lot. So really, I think as many different professionals and lay people and support people who can sort of open that door to talk about it, the knowledge base is there to help kids. We just need to get from the parent, the guardian, whoever, to the person with the knowledge.
What makes you motivated to work in this field, even though the emotional weight of it is not easy?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me in palliative care, I do feel like it really helps me to have perspective on my own life, to have great gratitude and appreciation for everything that I have, because I'm reminded every day of sort of how fragile and how temporary things are. And I think too about, every person that I see is somebody's mother or sister or grandmother. And how would I want my mother or sister or husband or whatever to be treated? Well, that's how I have to treat this person, because someday somebody's going to be doing that for my loved ones. So that's a big motivator for me as well.
Yeah, how beautiful to think that way, a different perspective. What role does a community play in children's grief?
Yeah, I think that there is a wonderful opportunity for a community to play a role in children's grief. There's some very natural ability in the community to do that if we sort of wanted to tap into that resource. Any child, once they're school age, that's a big community for them, right? Their school community. And what are the supports like at school? What do the children's teachers know? What do their peers know? Is there a counselor at school? Would the schools want to have some training in being able to support kids? Because this is not like we would love to think, oh, it's such a rare thing. Why do we need to teach our school counselor about this? But it's not a rare thing. It happens all the time. I think there are so many kids in school that are going through this, and the schools just don't know how to support them, so they don't do anything, right? If you don't know how to fix a problem, sometimes you don't want to look at the problem because you don't have a solution, so it's just too painful to look at it. I think, religious community is also another really important part of community that can help with supporting children in their grieving process. So when that's something that's available in the community to that family, I think that can be a huge help in providing sort of some perspective that is unique and that's meaningful.
You're the board member of the Children's Grief Foundation in Canada. Please tell us more about this foundation.
So I was absolutely thrilled in 2018 when I was approached by Christina Walton, who's the president of our foundation. She and I had met briefly working on a children's grief project called Camp Erin, which is a program that was sort of started in the United States and runs grief. Uh, weekend-long grief camping programs for kids. So we met then, and in 2018 she approached me and said that she had this idea that she would like to start a foundation to help children who are grieving, because one of the barriers for children being able to get the support they need is financial. We've been talking about another barrier, which is sort of recognition of the grief, right? But once the grief is recognized and the expertise is there, it's like, well, how do we access this expertise? Sometimes it's available through community, through coverage at no cost, but sometimes, unfortunately, there is a cost to helping support children through their grief. And Christina's idea was that, if we could at least raise money and give money to organizations that are providing services to kids, then kids could have free services so that we would remove the financial barrier. The second mission of the foundation she wanted to start was to increase awareness of children's grief. And so both of those things really resonated with me. And I said, yes, absolutely, I'm on board to help you start this foundation. And we had a few other people on the board when we started. And it takes, in Canada here, it takes a few years to do all the paperwork and get the government to sign off that you're a not-for-profit. So that was 2018 to 2020. And 2020, we got, March 2020, we got our official status as a not-for-profit organization. So then we could really start the work of raising money and giving money out. So that's sort of what we started out with, and we have just grown from there.
What are some of the initial struggles you faced while, establishing a foundation or when you want the programs to be heard by a wider audience?
Well, one of our biggest struggles that was a problem for both of those things was that we got our status in March of 2020, which was the start of COVID. So there was a lot of other stuff going on. In 2018, up until when we got our status, we were like, oh, when we finally get it, we're going to have a big launch party. We're going to go to a park and we're going to have balloons. And yeah, and then March 2020 and COVID happened, and it was very hard to get anybody's attention, obviously. I mean, as well, obviously, as a physician, I was dealing with big challenges at work, and everybody on the board in their different capacities was dealing with a lot of really challenging things. Um, so that was a struggle for sure when we got up and going. But we persisted and we started small and kept growing from there. In a way, I would say starting during COVID was a little bit helpful because in terms of the second mission, which is spreading awareness, at least during COVID, people were actually talking about death and dying, which like so rarely happens in our society. So we certainly did our best to take advantage of that. Lots of social media. We're able to share a lot of information about grieving that maybe in the beginning was people were more open to reception because of COVID.
I want to take a moment to thank you for listening and being part of this journey. This is a special podcast and episode, and I'm honored to be part of it as it is a global initiative where podcasters come together to amplify voices. We are speaking about children's grief to give it the attention it deserves. As you have heard so far, grief can be overwhelming and isolating, especially for children who may not have the words to express their emotions. That's why I am supporting the Children's Grief Foundation of Canada, a non-profit dedicated to funding programs that provide support, resources, and hope to grieving children and their families. How can you help? 1. Learn more about the foundation and their impactful work. 2. Spread the word because awareness leads to change. 3. Please consider donating to help them fund and run programs. Every conversation, every share, and every act of support makes a difference. You can find out more details in the show notes. Let's get back to the episode. Can you share some examples or some stories of how your programs have made a difference?
So what we try and do, and have been successful for most, is to run sort of two grant cycles each year, a spring granting cycle and a fall granting cycle. We developed sort of an application form and a grading form for the applications, and all applications are reviewed by two separate board members, graded by two separate board members, and then based on the scores brought to the entire board for review to decide who gets the grants. And so most years we've given out between 6 and 8 grants, like 3 or 4 in the spring and 3 or 4 in the fall. And it really spans a very broad range of things. So first of all, we're a national all across Canada. So we have had grants from almost every province come into us, and we try and, spread across from big cities to suburban to rural areas. All the different places have different needs. Uh, we've had some grants that are sort of very I don't want to say standard, but sort of what you would expect. So things like running a grief camp or buying books for a library, grief, children's grief books for a library, or grief kits to give to kids. And those are all great. And sometimes they're really important in the communities they're in. And we've had some really unique ones. So we've had two that are almost run by I want to say like EMS, like emergency medical service, where those providers, often police, sometimes ambulance, EMTs, have put together a request for help because they'll come into sort of an emergency situation. Somebody has died in the house and there's a child right there, and they're like, we don't know what to do. We want to do something. There's a poor child right here, right? And so providing them with support so that they can support kids sort of in that moment, to have something to give the child, I think was a really interesting and unique idea. We've had a program that was specifically for grief for children of people who have experienced suicide. So that's a very unique situation. Another program that we funded was a hospice who engaged a videographer filmmaker and made films with their two different ages of children's youth grieving groups. So they have these grief groups already, but they wanted to be able to make a film of it to share in their hospice, and then even with the children and their guardians' permission, to share online so that other kids could like look and see, oh, here are other children who've gone through something like what I've gone through, and just see on YouTube children talking about their own experience of it. So that was a great way to both help the children who are making the video and to extend it to help other children. Those are just a few examples of the programs that we've created or that we've sponsored. We haven't created them, we just sponsored them.
Grief is generally not talked about. We have established that. And even more with the children's grief, it's like a lack of understanding. How do you break this discomfort to a person, to a family you're speaking, who are first of all like unaware of it? You will look like, okay, you're speaking some other language. So how do you break this wall?
Yeah. I think there are some words that I've used that I find very powerful, and those words are hope and worry. And so when I'm talking to someone in that situation, I start with hope, and I say, I hope that everything's going to go well. I hope that you're going to have many happy times to come, and those kind of things where I'm and I really do hope those things. I'm not just saying it. I really hope that for them. And I think they can tell, right? Like I am on their side. I'm aligned with them. I'm hoping for the best for them. But then I say, but I'm worried about this. I'm worried about that. I'm worried about how this child is going to do at school. I'm worried about if they feel that they could have somebody to talk to or would want somebody to talk to. Um, and when they hear from me as the doctor that I'm worried about something, people tend to take that seriously, right?
That's
Um,
good.
and sometimes it's you have to build that trust with someone and find the right person in the family who's going to be the one to sort of advocate for that child. And it's not always the one you think it will be, right? So it may be an aunt, an uncle. It may often it's like a best friend of the patient, right? Because they are one step removed from it, and so they become sort of the advocate for the child, and reminding families that they have all these other resources, all these people who want to help them, and all they need to do is ask.
What are some of the ways a family can support a grieving child?
That's a great question. So I am not a grief counselor. I've worked with many grief counselors, but I think one of the things to me that I've felt very powerful is if there is discussion with the child before the person dies about what's happening, that gives the child a chance to express themselves and be heard. And I've seen things like children will make younger children say will make pictures for the person that they're losing, or write letters to the person that they're losing, and even like these pictures will go into the coffin with the person, or they'll buy a teddy bear. The child will buy a teddy bear for the parent, or so much good can be done if the grief and loss is acknowledged before the person goes, right? Because we do start our grieving then, and so that's a huge thing. Uh, as I said, I think, because my perspective is as a physician, I think there's a unique piece to sort of making the medical not so frightening to children. A lot of children have questions about the medical and they don't know who to ask. So bringing the child to a doctor's appointment so they can ask, like the doctor, is this contagious? Is this something I have to worry about getting? If I get a cold, does that mean I'm going to die? Right? Because kids, of course, they don't understand all these things. Now, these are younger kids, obviously older kids, teenagers, they'll have different questions. Sometimes the kids' questions are very similar to the adults' questions. It's interesting, but they're I found they'll be more direct about it, right? So did did my parent do something to cause this to happen to them, or did they not do something? And it's really important, because if we don't answer these questions, they'll go on Google doctor, and who knows what they're going to find, right? Not always the truth.
That's a terrible one to do.
Right. It is, for sure, for sure.
If you could change one thing of how the children's grief is handled right now, what would you change?
Oh boy, just one thing.
Had to pick.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe two.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess, what I've part of what I've been saying already is relates to the bigger picture of how we talk about death and dying in our society, right? Because until we can have a more open conversation about that in our society as a whole, you can't have the conversation with children, whether it's before or after the person dies. And I really think that that is something that can change and that would be extremely powerful. So when I was growing up, many, many years ago, people didn't say the word cancer. Like, if you said it, you whispered it, or you said, they have the letter C, like you just say they have C, that you wouldn't say it. And you'd whisper it or you just wouldn't say it. And now, right, it's cancer this, cancer that, breast cancer, prostate cancer. Like, people say it no problem. So if that could happen, then I think it could definitely happen that people can talk openly about death and dying, because cancer isn't even something that happens to everybody, but death and dying is something that happens to everybody, right? And I think if we can make it, normalize it, to say those words, to have those conversations, to talk about grief as not just being the day of the funeral or the week after the funeral, like, grief is a long process. It's really a never-ending process. It changes over time, and yet we don't talk about it. We don't acknowledge it, and we need to acknowledge it for adults, and we need to acknowledge it for children as well. It doesn't mean we need to live in grief all the time. Um, but we need to be able to open that door and go there when we need to, and not bury it and not hide it, because how can you get support if you can't have an open door and talk about it?
Yeah, same thing happened to me because nobody in my family or in a community we spoke about the grief. I did not even know that I had grief, that I was going through grief. So all I had was develop all the symptoms of other things. Like I didn't know. I understood my mother was dead, but after that, how do I move ahead?
Right, right. Yeah. It's so hard. And I think there's really something to talking to other people who are the same age as you, who are going through something similar to you. So the things like grief camps or grief support groups, it's like, yes, you have the professional and you have your family, but you also have a cohort of people who are your same age. And obviously, not everybody your age is going to experience grief the same, but it again, it normalizes it, and you can say, like, oh well, this person, they're doing their grief like this. My grief is like this, but you can talk about it, right? And I think so much of the grief is so isolating, don't you think?
Yes, it is very isolating.
Yeah.
Because this is what I learned from the surroundings of mine that you need to handle it on your own.
Right.
But contrary, you're not supposed to.
No.
You can't, especially when you're not even a well developed adult. And I'm speaking about like 28 years back. And even now, it has improved little bit, but not to an extent of where people speak openly.
Yeah, yeah, and I think people are afraid of intense emotions. Um, when I have when I'm running my clinic, it's very common that patients or family members cry, and other doctors, in oncologists, general practitioners, it would be like, oh my god, the person's crying, whereas I'm like, yeah, of course they're crying. Why wouldn't they be crying? And it's okay that they're crying, and I let them cry, and a lot of times they're so embarrassed, they're like, I can't believe I'm crying. I'm like, no, it's okay, cry, have some tissue, cry, we can wait, like that. How can you not have those feelings, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So, especially when people are not talking about it, raising fund on something that could be challenging.
Yeah.
So, how have you
Yeah.
been able to kind of push or turn this around?
Yeah, it is. It's really challenging. So, on the plus side, generally charities for children are well received, right? People like to help children. So, there's that. But on the negative side, yeah, people don't want to talk about death and dying. So, we're caught somewhere in the middle. And
I think from the fundraising, we've had sort of donors big and small, and what I can say is, I think every one of the people or organizations that have donated to us have that sense of having experienced children's grief, right? So some of it is personal, individuals who've themselves experienced or have had a family member who've experienced. Some are professional organizations like funeral directors, organizations and businesses has been a huge source of support for us because you can imagine at a funeral and the funeral director sees all the family and then they see these kids, right, and they're sitting there going, oh my god, these poor children, who is helping them, right? So just bearing witness to it, like I do in palliative care, like the funeral directors bear witness to it. All these people have been sort of great supports to us in terms of fundraising.
You bring a beautiful point because people who have personal stories or have seen their loved one going through it is the one who are more receptive to it. And it's the same goes for me. I feel very comfortable when that person is understanding where I come from. But I feel even though I am very close to some other closest friend, but I won't be able to speak about this particular. There is a kind of the wall. This part, it's like okay, we cannot talk.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's very scary to someone who hasn't experienced it before. It could be very frightening to them. Just the expression of emotion in our society, like I guess it's okay to cry to your friends or your family about, say, a romantic relationship that's gone wrong. Then it's okay to express sadness. Uh, eh, but we have sort of very distinct areas where it's okay, it's socially acceptable to, express sadness, and other areas where it's just not socially acceptable. I think another really important hope that I have for the future is that our popular culture, our media, will do more to portray and to normalize this because if we can see it more and more on screen or on whatever, just like we see rom-coms or you know FBI dramas, like then oh yeah, this is a thing. Okay, we can talk about it.
Absolutely. How can people contribute to the Children's Grief Foundation?
So we have a website. It's the Children's Grief Foundation of Canada .org, and right on the front of the website, there's a donate button, so you can definitely do that. Um, we're also really happy if people follow us online. If you don't have money to donate, that's okay. If you follow us on Instagram and on LinkedIn and Facebook, whatever, and share and reshare our posts, that's really helpful for us because not all our posts are about give us money, right? Like a lot of our posts, most of our posts is about information about how children grieve. So if people help us spread the word, that is a huge help for us. To just spread that information means everything.
Definitely. Is there a message you would like to leave? Perhaps on hope or healing or the importance of community on children's grief?
The idea that I would like to leave people with is that hopefully all the children who have experienced loss and who have experienced grief grow up into adults who want to reach out and do better for the next generation than what they experienced. They can use their own personal experience to make sure that whatever their experience was, the next person has it even, a little bit easier. I think it's what I try to do. It seems very much like what you're trying to do. That's my biggest hope is it takes each individual doing their little bit to try and make it better for the next one.
Yeah, that's profoundly powerful and beautiful at the same time. Thank you so much, Marissa, for having this conversation, the foundation which is very close to my heart. And thank you so much for all the information and talking to us on this episode of Discovering Journeys.
Thank you for highlighting our foundation and for the great work that you're doing. I really appreciate it so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Discovering Journeys. I would love for this podcast to reach as many people as possible. So please remember to subscribe, rate, and leave a positive review. Share this podcast with someone you think who would appreciate this conversation. Check out the show notes for all the links and details. Until next time, keep embracing your journey and discovering new paths.